Hi, this is Glenn Peoples. You're listening to Your Morning Jacket. Your Morning Joe. Obviously, you're listening to the Your Morning Coffee podcast with Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart, weekly music news for the new music business. Take it away, guys.
From Billboard, the changing world of record label streaming.
And also from Billboard, Spotify lays out roadmap to higher margins. Here's the plan. I know it seems like we're not doing that many stories, but Jay, these are both so dense.
Oh, there's so much to it.
So much to it. So Jay, what do you say we just kind of get comfortable here and let's hit the play button, because here we go.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand!
Your morning coffee is on the air. On the air, on the air, on the air, on the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
All right, Jay Gilbert, brother Jay Gilbert, it is good to see you, my friend, on a late Sunday.
You.
This is kind of like the latest we've ever recorded the show, I think.
Yeah, but the show must go on.
The show must go on.
We just roll with it. Sometimes it's early in the morning. Sometimes it's later in the afternoon. It's all good.
But we've been traveling. Each of us have been traveling, so that's why we kind of move it around. And because, Jay, you don't sleep, you've got... Not only do you do this podcast, not only do you do Music Business Weekly podcast, you've also got the great podcast with Glenn Peoples, the Behind the Set List. So now you're doing 3 podcasts, Jay.
I know, it sounds a little silly, doesn't it?
And the Behind the Set List is fantastic. And of course, you get to talk to artists on that. Oh my gosh.
Thank you so much. You know, that it's just been such a joy to do because artists don't really get a chance to talk about their set lists much. And there's so much great information there. You know, why do you play this cover song? Why do you open with this? You know, there's a cadence to a set list, and it's really important, and it's interesting. Like, we had Ann Wilson on the last episode, and she's been creating the set lists for Heart for decades. And there's a method to her madness, and it was really interesting listening to her describe, you know, why she does what she does. And this next week, it'll be Kurt Smith from Tears for Fears. And I mean, it's super interesting. Opening with one of your biggest songs and playing 7 songs off your new album. There are things that you just wouldn't normally expect a band to do. And so we're pretty excited about that. And thank you for mentioning that.
Hey, you know what I want to mention also, you know, you talk about that, the kind of the nuance of that. So a good buddy of mine, Jim Lenz, who's now down in Nashville working for TKO Artist Management, or booking agency side of it, he has told me a number of times that he has had to take artists in and sit them down and say, you got to do a better set list. And sometimes artists don't want to do some of their hit songs. And he's like, wait a minute. You've got to do those songs. And so
people are coming to hear that.
That's
they expect
right.
it.
So it's a skill. And not all artists do it right. That's what I've gathered from, you know, hanging out with him. You know, he's had to kind of had the tough talk and say, okay, this set list is not great. Let's figure out a better one.
Yeah. There's definitely an art to it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's, anyways, just kind of toss that aside, that some artists are really not very good at that. But anyway, that is what it is. And then speaking of Glenn Peoples, He's got the fantastic, it's weekly, right? It's his weekly newsletter called The Ledger. And a great piece this last week came out on Friday. And by the way, the Ledger is his weekly newsletter about the economics of the music business. And nobody better than Glenn Peoples, who of course is the lead analyst over at Billboard, to talk about all of this money stuff. But a great piece, and I'll let you kick it off because we were talking about it before we hit record.
First of all, we appreciate Glenn doing our intro this week, and it's so funny. And he's my partner in crime when it comes to the Behind the Setlist podcast. And I think the Ledger, if I'm not mistaken, you have to subscribe to Billboard Pro to get this. I'm pretty sure that's the way it is, and I do subscribe, and it's worth every penny. But he had something really interesting in his newsletter this last week. He said, since the early days of subscription music streaming, platforms have been measured by a single financial metric. And you and I talk about this a lot. Average revenue per user, or ARPU. Now, after a decade and a half as a business and 4 years as a public company, Spotify seemingly wants to take ARPU down a peg. Its replacement, judging from the company's investor presentation in New York this last Wednesday, is now what they call lifetime value, or LTV, lifetime value. And that measures a user's total contribution over time to the company's bottom line. It's a holistic metric that helps the company assess its decisions and guides where it invests its money.
So he goes on, he says, LTV combines how long a consumer uses Spotify and how much money they either spend on a subscription or generate through advertising. To calculate LTV, take a user's contribution margin, revenue less costs of revenue, such as music licensing fees, and discount to a single amount in today's dollars. And he says, in parentheses, it's like the way an entire corporation or a publishing catalog is valued. Subscription ARPU is just one aspect of LTV. Monthly churn rate also plays a key role here. As the churn rate falls, people stick around longer, listen to more podcasts, pay more subscription fees, and raise the average LTV. On the flip side, something that increases churn rate can have an adverse effect on LTV. ARPU alone can't distinguish between the long-term implications of different decisions.
Very interesting. This all came out on Wednesday, and he said one of the most enlightening pieces of data that was revealed was Spotify's monthly churn rate, which fell from 5.5% in 2017 to 3.9% at the end of 2021. That was according to their CFO, Paul Vogel. So really interesting stuff. If you're interested in kind of the financials or the economics of streaming and the new music business, this is absolutely the best. It's Glenn Peoples, and the email is called The Ledger.
Yes, and we're going to talk a lot about streaming later on in the show. Gosh. That's right.
The other thing that you and I have been talking about a lot lately is TikTok, and we're not going to talk about that this week, but there has been a lot of, a lot of information that we've shared, a lot of stories that we've covered. And if you're interested in the continuing wave of stories about TikTok's impact on the new music business, there were 3 really interesting stories in your morning coffee this last week. The 3 are, one was from Pitchfork. The headline was, TikTok is turning music marketing into a labyrinthian game. Number 2 is from Hypebot, and the headline was, should legacy musicians even try to use TikTok for promotion? I think the answer is yes. And then from The Vulture, so your song went viral on TikTok. What's next? So we're not going to dig deep into that because we've been covering TikTok so much in the last 2-3 weeks. We want to get into these 2 really great pieces from Billboard this week. But if you're interested in the ongoing wave of stories about TikTok, check out your morning coffee this last week.
And just to remember, make sure you just do subscribe to Jay's newsletter. The Your Morning Coffee newsletter comes out every Friday morning at an insanely early hour West Coast. It is, I said this a million times, Jay is like the guy in high school you want to sit next to who knows all the answers to the test. So it's such a great resource, and it's been, for me, it just... it just helps. Jay stays up late at night doing this for you personally. So make sure you subscribe. And by the way, Jay is Jay Gilbert. He is the co-founder of music marketing and strategy company Label Logic. As mentioned, he is the curator of the Your Morning Coffee newsletter, and he's also a former executive with Universal Music, Sony Music, and Warner Music, and of course Fox Home Entertainment as well.
And this guy sitting across me that you can't see, but you can certainly hear, is Mike Etchart, longtime host of Sound and Vision Radio, formerly of SST Records, Warner Music, Capital EMI, and Universal. Speaking of SST, have you read that Jim Rulin book on SST Records?
It's sitting next to me, actually. I have not read it.
I can't wait to hear, since you were there and you know how the sausage is made a little bit. When you do read that, no pressure. Let's do a little book review.
Yes.
Chat.
Have you read it?
No, but I ordered it.
Okay, yeah. I just got it I think last Wednesday, so I'm going to read it for sure. But a couple of friends that we work together there, they have sent me little images, little pages
clips
from our era. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to kind of getting into it. So
I can't wait. And for those that don't know what we're talking about, there's a new book by Jim Rulin called "Corporate Rock Sucks: The Rise and Fall of SST Records," a no-holds-barred narrative. History of the iconic label that brought the world Black Flag, Husker Du, Sonic Youth, Soundgarden, and more. I'm really excited.
I can hardly wait. I've kind of glanced at it. So, yeah, it looks really, really fun. By the way, and we would be remiss, Jay, if we didn't talk about the great folks that help us put the show on every week, including Hypebot. Since 2004, Hypebot has chronicled the new music industry and the trends and technologies that are changing how music is discovered, consumed, marketed, and monetized. It is edited daily by founder Bruce Houghton with help from Alana Bonilla. Hypebot and sister blog Music Think Tank are published by live music discovery and marketing platform Bands in Town.
Speaking of Bands in Town, over 65 million live music fans trust Bands in Town to get their personalized concert alerts, recommendations, and messages from their favorite artists. It's the #1 artist services platform connecting over 550,000 artists with their superfans. Managers, labels, agencies, and artists access their own dashboard to manage and promote their tour dates across all platforms. So check out Bands in Town.
Indeed. Fantastic. So big thanks to them. So Jay, let's jump into this. Boy, this first article, I was traveling this weekend, as I mentioned. I took this on the plane and I read it up and I read it back because there's so much amazing stuff. This is from Billboard. It's the changing world of record label streaming, and this has been an ongoing series that we have talked about a lot. The other episodes, I guess you could say, of this particular thing. But boy, this one is. There's one of these. There's a lot of stuff that you want to print out, but this is one that you got to print out because there's some really
series.
Interesting things in here.
Yeah.
By Dan Reese. Is it Reese or? Yeah,
I thought it's Rice.
It's Rice,
but we'll have to ask those guys so we get it right. But
sorry, Dan.
We've covered a lot of his stuff, and I sent him a little note last time we covered this because, as you mentioned, this is fourth in a series. The first one, and we've covered all of these. On this program. The first one was on A&R, and that was interesting to hear how A&R works in this new music business. Then they did radio promotion, and then the last one that they did was just on overall marketing. And this one, so you understand kind of the headline is The Changing World of, and then colon.
Right.
And so this one is record label streaming. And they talked to about a half dozen marketing people from labels. And they talked to Brandon Becker from Matador, Max Kaplan from Columbia, Adam Abramson, who I've worked with over at Elektra, Nicole Sabai, Raymond Acosta from Ramas, and Josh Remsburg from Warner Brothers. And they got their take on this new music business and, how labels, how they work with streaming.
Yeah, the approach and kind of essentially sort of the retraining of everyone to focus instead of on physical sales on streams. I do want to mention, though, Jay, they start by talking about a Pavement song that came out back in the late 90s, a couple of different songs. One is called Spit on a Stranger, one is called Harness Your Hopes. Before we even get into the depth of this, they mentioned that Harness Your Hopes really began to explode on Spotify. And in this age of so much data and so many things that we can glean, they basically say that in 2017, it says, for reasons that are still a little mysterious to both the band and its label Matador, Harness Your Hopes began to explode on Spotify. I kind of took that to mean that with everything we know about streaming, and we know a lot, there are still some mysteries out there. And it's amazing how sometimes just songs kind of come up from the ashes, the songs that came out a long time ago for whatever reason, and they explode. And that's really the difference. One of the things certainly that is way different from the old music business and the new music business, that sometimes things can just catch fire in a way that you can't really pinpoint.
Well, I would argue that that's always been that way. When Adam and I worked together, I was handling WIA ADA globally, the Amazon account, and he was at Atlantic Records. And I remember even in those days, there were certain things that we would watch. For example, Amazon's Movers and Shakers. And that chart, back then, I believe it was for physical, like CD, vinyl, and then they had one for digital and a download, not for streaming. And it was a chart of things that were increasing as a percentage on a rolling 24-hour basis. And every now and then, one of our records would just shoot to the top of Movers and Shakers, and we'd check around, like, was there a sync license? Was there a tour announced? Did somebody die? And sometimes it was a mystery. You just didn't know. And we would look by market to see what DMA, which for those that don't know, that's designated marketing area. We would look, what DMA is it popping from? Is there any radio airplay coming from that? And the same thing kind of happened that you just described. Every now and then something would start to get heat and we wouldn't know why.
Yeah. It's so interesting that is still things that happen, but it makes it kind of fun, right? It's just, sometimes you get that little gift.
Yeah. And today it's easier, I think, to spot because every distribution company basically has a dashboard, and there's ways that you're notified when something is spiking. And there are all sorts of platforms that you can subscribe to that will do something similar to that. And what I mean by that is if something just overperforms, you're notified, or you can go into your dashboard and see, what's overperforming. And then you look and try to figure out why. And a lot of times you can figure out why, but there are always surprises. It could be a TikTok video where they're using your track that you weren't aware of, or, somebody's starting to play that song as a cover song. There's so many different reasons why, but today with all the data we have, it's a little bit easier to kind of identify them earlier on.
Yeah, exactly. But so that's kind of how the article starts, talking about this Pavement song back from an album in 1997, actually. But it says this song's belated journey to well-known status and the band's and label's embrace of the streaming partners that helped it along is emblematic of the changing relationship between record labels and the streaming services on which they've come to rely, where one of the keys, particularly for an indie artist, is in finding moments like that to really amplify and connect with listeners that feels organic and not so forced. And that's kind of where we kind of lead into that. It's really a different mindset. And I think further in Max Kaplan, one of the great lines that I circled on here, Max Kaplan, he's the VP of Digital Sales over at Columbia. He said the big thing with streaming, and something that I think people are still trying to understand, is the marketplace originally was set up to sell a product. But if you need to trigger actions multiple times over a long period of time in order to promote an artist and in order to get paid, you need to think about how you disperse that content. You're competing for time and not money. So think about that. You're competing for time and not money. So the framework has really shifted from that perspective.
Yeah, and I'm hearing that from everyone across the board. It's not about necessarily ownership. It's about access, for example. And what you just described is spot on. And there's a really great couple of sentences here from Adam Abramson. Again, that's Elektra's head of sales and streaming. He said, "My job has always essentially been pitching songs to gatekeepers, which were, the next step directly to consumers. In the olden days, that was lobbying for listening posts and end caps and sale pricing and positioning and all of that. But philosophically, it's the same thing now. I'm still lobbying now for playlisting and banners and digital on and off platform visibility, using a lot of the same tools, just in a different marketplace.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting way of approaching that and thinking about it. And and then we talked last week about, as we go on in this article, we're going to talk a lot about, again, this extension of keep putting things in the marketplace, new things in the marketplace and we talked about EPs and the changing dynamic of what an album is and was, and how we're moving to these smaller packages, but more things being spread out over time. And that's really, again, a complete different paradigm of the way we used to do it.
Yeah, completely. It used to be you'd drop an album every year, every 18 months, and you'd have a tour surrounding it, and you may have a couple of singles. And now it's that always on, in air quotes, always on music industry. And what they allude to in this piece is that it's not as rigid as saying, okay, every 4 to 6 weeks we're going to drop a track. What Adam alludes to later in this piece is that you really watch the data. Mm-hmm. And if something's performing, you let it ride and maybe put a little more gasoline on that fire. And that's different than it's been in the past.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they start by talking about the job, and what is the job? What is this kind of sales and streaming and oversight job these days? And they say, there are many paths into the streaming space at a label through the sales department, which originally picked up the DSP partners in the early days, through the revenue or finance departments, which have been heavily involved in trying to maximize that revenue from streaming and shifting strategies to do so, or through digital marketing, which has in many ways grown up and matured alongside the streaming evolution. And it seems like everyone has lots of people paying attention to this, but it is kind of parsed out a little bit differently at labels. And you were one of the early adopters of all of this when we were at Universal together, and paying attention to this. And it was mostly downloads then, but as we've transitioned from downloads to streaming, again, downloads was far closer to the old music business than
it was.
Yeah,
it really was, because it was ownership and it wasn't necessarily access. And I remember in those days going to those sales meetings. And, I was kind of sitting off to the side and everybody would go through their numbers and I would give my numbers. And until they started becoming real numbers, then it was like, okay, we need to pay attention to this. And like he points out in this piece, it fell on the sales and marketing teams. And later these record companies evolved and they call it commerce generation or revenue generation. And it's not sales and marketing anymore. It's all this holistic approach. And compare that to the way it used to be. And Kaplan points this out, in the old days, if you didn't have real estate on the front page of iTunes, that was a big deal. He said, if you didn't have real estate there, your release may as well never have come out. That's how important that was. He said, iTunes Store dominated the digital realm. So when streaming came along, the job was similar. You're working in partnership with the available DSPs to highlight your content, to do creative marketing campaigns together. But it's still somewhat, of the wild, wild west, he says. And I sense that, and I can see that, because it's the same game in some ways. It's about relationships. And I think Adam points this out a little later in the piece too. It's about relationships and follow through. It's about telling the narrative and the story about why that release is important and why they should care. But it's also showing them the data on, and not everything has data, right? But a lot of it does. And they can see, look, this thing's being skipped very few times. It's being added to personal libraries a lot. It's got this sync license. They're going on tour. There's a collaboration on here. And those are these things that they can take back to their label and artist relations people at the DSPs to kind of get that either second bite at the apple, or to get them to pay attention to something like you just mentioned. There was that record that had been out for years, that Pavement. Or, you can take a look at that Fleetwood Mac track, that got the guy drinking the ocean spray skating down the street, on a skateboard. You can get a second bite at that apple if there's strong data or a strong narrative. But the majors have these relationships, and the major indies with these DSPs, and they have these weekly meetings, and they can convey that, and that's how their jobs have changed.
Well, and I think it's also a business of so much more now of patience and really sort of methodically looking at all that data, and that is a tremendous undertaking, and that's a little bit, and we've talked a lot about when we were in our early days of the business, when it was the changeover from basically reporting for Billboard charts to SoundScan and then to BDS. So we actually finally had some real concrete data with which to kind of determine what was going on in the market in those days. But boy, the exponential change which we have today, where it's just an avalanche of data, and it's nuts, and I don't know how. It just makes my head spin when there's just so much available data out there. But that really is it's causing and helping people make educated decisions about how to move forward, how to proceed, and what how it directs your campaigns, which is remarkable in the relatively short amount of time, how dramatically things have changed.
It's crazy. One of the most important roles for label execs, it says in this piece, in the streaming space, it's about relationships, not dissimilar to how promoters cultivate relationships with radio programmers to get songs played. And I've always felt like that it resembles radio in some ways, and in some ways it doesn't at all. But in some ways, it's more of a meritocracy and based on the quality of the music. But in other ways, it is relationship built. And there's this woman, where is it? Nicole Sabai, right? She's the VP of Revenue at Interscope, and there's that revenue position again.
Yes.
Right. She said that what shows up every Thursday night or Friday morning. Friday's a release date, but Thursday night at like 9 p.m. you start seeing these placements pop. What shows up every Thursday night or Friday morning is certainly not accidental, she said. That's weeks and weeks of work to plot out as much as we can. Always certain things are discretionary with the DSPs and up to their editorial voice, but there are a lot of things that we are actively working towards landing for our artists. Back in the days of iTunes, it was the slider and the brick and, their mass email. And there were just certain placements that, like they said in this piece, if you didn't land some of those, you were dead in the water, and, people were screaming, And today, it hasn't gone away. It's just a different medium now.
And I want to go back to something that Adam Abramson said, which is really interesting, talking about, as you're kind of moving and setting up this stuff. He says it's about maintaining relationships and making them, meaning the DSP partners and kind of everyone out there, feel like they're part of the project from the beginning. Getting people music early, making contact with the artists if they're in the same market, getting them out to shows, and really making them feel that they're part of our family, because ultimately we're all partners in this. So that kind of the 6 Ps, right? Proper planning prevents piss poor performance. It is, it is building your team, and because it's so competitive, really, and we came up in an era too when a lot of senior executives ignored release schedules and timelines to get stuff into the marketplace, and said this just has to come out and whatever, and then
to make our quarter.
Yeah, and forcing the issue and pushing, kind of stressing the entire ecosystem because you were behind. And that just doesn't fly anymore, right? It just doesn't fly in this environment. You've got to be proactive and patient and start with a laid out plan and really get it together early. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. And what you just described, what Adam said, that's kind of always been the case. And yes, there are people who would, push a release up to make a quarter or do whatever they had to do. But the way that you build that groundswell, especially for a new developing artist, all those tools and tactics we still use, getting that early ownership, which could be getting somebody important into the studio to see the process, happening. It could be, a meet and greet. It could be, a visit to a radio station. It's letting them know every step along the way what the plan is, and getting their input and seeing what programs they have to offer and which ones might make sense, whether you're a DSP or, you do digital and physical like Amazon does. And I think that's really important. Josh Remsburg, who's a senior VP of commerce, there's that word again, at Warner Brothers, he said all along the way, the job is more than just about pitching playlist editors and lining up marketing opportunities. It's managing people and also personalities and expectations. And I thought that was pretty smart. It says here that data can often tell a story that's not obvious on the surface, and I agree with that. But then there's also the emotional and music part, and that's still a big piece of this story. And that was Adam Abramson who said that. The curators at these DSPs are mostly real people that have come from music backgrounds, and they're true passionate music fans, right? And while the data is great and I can use it to show that there's some stickiness or potential or something real is happening, it's also really important sometimes to just talk about the songs and the artists and their influences and the subgenres and really nerd out about music as a whole. And I can tell you that from my experience working with Spotify, Apple Music, Pandora, Deezer, Amazon, whoever it is, they're music freaks there.
Yeah.
And the thing that unites them and us is the same thing that brings you and I together, whether we're recording a podcast or just having lunch, is we can't wait to just, as Adam puts it, nerd out, like geek out on, hey, did you hear that thing? That I think is the equation that's sometimes missed, and why we always say a playlist is not a marketing plan. There's so much more to building that brand, building that excitement around a release, and just releasing music in general.
Josh talking about sort of the managing people and also personalities and expectations, he kind of went on to say, and that's not just internally at the label, but it's also from an artist side, from a manager side. Artists and managers, as they should, have high expectations. And there are so many releases every single week, and rightfully so. Every artist and manager wants more than their fair share. And as a label, we want more than our fair share on behalf of those artists. But that's an interesting point, too, when you're talking about managing expectations. And you and I have both dealt with artists and their managers over the years, and that's a hard conversation to have. But now there's also so much data to back up those expectations and those plans. And so I think that's one of the great things about data and all of the things that now are at the disposal of labels and managers and artists, is that there's a bunch of stuff with which to glean important information. And that we didn't have that in the day in a similar way that we do now.
Yeah, it's funny. Some of these things we're describing are exactly the same as they were back in the day, just maybe with a little bit different twist. And then some of them are not like that at all. And I think the best description of that, Raymond Acosta said that back in the day, it was as if we were a brand new industry, like the terms algorithm, trend, and viral, right? We hear those all the time. They began to become a part of our daily parlance. Everything evolved, strategies, work plans, artists began to release more content more frequently, to your point, and even release dates changed. And that's something back in the day that didn't happen very often. Once you set that street date and put your PR in place and your tour and all of that, it was a solid rocket booster. It was going to go, and that's the end of it. But today, if something starts to overperform, they might pump the brakes on new music. And having that freedom is really important. And then he goes on to say that, as streaming grew in importance, fans gravitated towards it. New players like Apple, Tidal, Amazon Music came into the space, and labels began to drill down on what a streaming campaign was and how different from sales first rollout. But again, there's some holdover things that you and I talk about. For example, everybody is still so focused on that first week, and that's old school. The newer, younger breed of record executives, they're not that focused on that first week. It's more of a release cadence and a release cycle, and they look at each track leading up to an album or an EP, and they watch the data. It's a bigger, a larger picture, whereas some folks from the old ways, they just look at that first week or two and then they're done. Yeah. And that's how the industry was a while back.
But again, sometimes there's still managers, there's still artists that are going to be focused on that. And that's how you manage that it can be tough. Brandon Becker mentioned, he said the first pivot was really the editorial. It became how do we get New Music Friday for this release? How do we get the Times Square billboards? Those types of things were real top of mind. They still are, but I feel like that was the campaign in a lot of ways. Once there was more competition in the market, you saw the rise of the exclusive albums, which is definitely something we had to navigate with a bunch of artists. That subsided a bit. There's still a little bit of that with original content pieces like Spotify Sessions, Apple's at-home sessions, and those types of things where artists are doing original recordings for those platforms. But for a traditional album release, you see that less and less, which is great. He said, I think the services realized it was isolating fans and resulting in negative press for them in some ways. So that shifted. And a lot of the artists dislike that as well. So you're talking about some of these things that used to be just de rigueur, that things you always wanted to try to do, and then you're not. No, that wasn't really getting to where we wanted it to get us to. So let's not do that.
Right. And when we say a playlist is not a marketing plan, there's a reason for that. And he just illustrates this beautifully. If you have those are pretty lofty goals, and it's great to have goals. But if you're in New Music Friday, you may only be in there for a week or two. Then what do you have? And if you have that Times Square billboard, that's a great look, and everybody wants that look. It's magic, right? And then you can take your picture of your artist in front of it. Look what I did. This is so great. And it's big, but it doesn't last a long time. So you have to have all these other things in place. Adam Abramson went on to say it's always important to ship a lot of CDs or vinyl records, but now that streaming has become what it is, there's a lot more eyes on my department because we're hitting consumers directly, and I think that's key. He said we have to be so in sync with every other department at the label. It used to be siloed. When you and I worked at Universal, it was a sales department, the marketing department, maybe it was that technology group that you and I worked with, eLabs, ECAT, but everybody kind of had their silo, their group, and some of them were better at others than, working together. Mm-hmm. And what Adam's saying now, and I couldn't agree more, is that doesn't work anymore. You have to be in sync with all of these different departments in a streaming world. Totally.
One of the things they really mentioned that you and I have talked about a lot, which is so true, and this is from Raymond Acosta. He said, but streaming has also opened up a truly globalized market, turning regionally focused labels into worldwide distributors and allowing for the proliferation of new genres of music into the U.S. in a much more obvious and accessible way. For Latin, he said, it gave us the opportunity to take our language and our culture to the world. Things shifted for the better because prior to this system, it was very tough to be heard in other places. Without a doubt, streaming has globalized music. It has also been a great opportunity for new talent. Today, you can upload your music to all the platforms, and you have the opportunity to be heard by millions simultaneously. And I think back again to our days where there's another silo was the international department, right? And it was really hard / impossible sometimes for music that was very successful in other territories for them to get any traction or any interest from the parent company to release it here in the States. And I'm happy to see that
because there were costs involved.
Yes, that's right.
Some pretty heavy costs, whereas streaming, you've got those digital files at the DSPs, and a lot of this stuff is global. And yes, there are markets like France and Japan where they lean pretty heavy on local repertoire. But as you're pointing out, that local repertoire is starting to get ears in these other countries, and it's become this globalized music industry because the barrier to entry is so low, and we don't have those production costs of making vinyl CDs and then shipping them and placing them in stores and putting advertising around it. Now it's just, again, it comes back to that access.
And I would say that there was a little bit of prejudice back in those days. I think a lot of people in the international departments were frustrated because the gatekeepers at the parent company here in the States, why would kids want to listen to a record that's in Spanish or in Tagalog or Japanese?
Right.
And clearly that has been shown to be not the case at all. In fact, consumers have a voracious appetite for things new, and they are not bothered by it not being in their native language at all.
No, I mean, look at the explosion in Latin music. And I just love just the globalization of music in general from streaming, which kind of leads us to this section of this article called The Future. And this is leading into something even better in a moment. But just to kind of paraphrase this section called The Future, Dan says, it's easy to forget that streaming in the U.S. is still in its infancy. Yeah. And that its dominance as a source of revenue and focus is still only 7 or 8 years old. And I tell people that all the time. Like, the joke is, this has been around a week and a half. Let's just calm down and, just be smart about all of this. I think the big things we're seeing right now on the DSP side are social tools, specifically with short form video, right? We talk about that every week, kind of rehashing the tic-tac short form experience in some ways and finding ways to get that bite-sized content in front of people and drive them further into the wormhole of content. That was Becker that said that. We're also seeing a big focus on HD audio and spatial audio from a number of the services. And that's something that you and I talk about quite a bit because we're big fans of Dolby Atmos and spatial audio. And when done right, it's mind-blowing. It is really special. And, as he was saying in this, that this has been a major focus for him for the last 18 months or so. And I think that's really important.
The next part it was something that you and I have talked about both on and off the show, but it's really important to mention. And this is, I think, Adam Kaplan talking about this. Music, of course, is hardly the only sector leaning into streaming technology and fighting for attention, which means that the format shift from sales to streams will continue to present some issues to solve for the labels down the line. And he said, I think the music industry is going to have problems with competition for time. Historically, I've been competing against other labels for who can have the biggest music release. But if you're competing for people's time instead of money, and remember we started talking about that, you can buy a movie and an album or 10 albums, but if there's only 24 hours in a day, you're competing with music, with video games, with Netflix, with Hulu, with TikTok. People we didn't see as competitors in the past are competitors now for people's time. And you and I have talked a lot about the music is kind of, fortunately, it's kind of off to the side, but when you broaden it out and you open that focus to talk about video games, movies, and television, there are not enough hours in the day to absorb, to take in, to watch, to listen, all of the great content out there.
Right. You're absolutely right. That's so perfectly said. The thing about music that's a little bit different, I think, is that you can listen to music at a wedding and a funeral. You can listen to music while you're cleaning your house. You can listen to music and do other things. It's challenging sometimes. Yes, there are audiobooks, but it's challenging to read a book and do other things sometimes. Play a video game and do some of these other things sometimes. And you're right. It's all about that allotment, that time.
There's still only 24 hours in the day.
Yeah. Well, someone told me one time that when you're young, you have lots of time and a little bit of money. And when you get older, you have a little bit more money, but very little time. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't agree more with that sentiment here that, they're competing on time.
Yeah. He said, so you have to find a reason for people to want to listen to music more than watch a movie. And that's a decision that people didn't always have to make, or that people in my position, referring to somebody at a label, didn't always have to consider when putting things out. That's only going to escalate as we get into the future with more phones, more screens, more platforms, more everything.
100%.
Yeah,
and that's,
absolutely.
That's why one of the many things that makes this piece such an amazing read. And just like you, I had to go through it several times as I'm highlighting it and reading it. And it's just, there's so much great information in here. And, watch this space, as they say, because 6 months, 12 months down the road, some of these things will have evolved. And then the final section here, which is the best part of this article, the headline is, what goes into a great streaming campaign? And I'll just take the first one. Adam Abramson, like I said, we work together. I have a great deal of respect for him. He's very good at what he does. They asked him first, and his response to what goes into a great streaming campaign, he said, it's having everything come together at once. I think that's really important. There's so much we need to do as a record label to make a great streaming campaign happen. We're never ones to rely on any one sector of our company to make something successful. We need every department to pull their weight so we can give a good story to the DSPs, there's that narrative again, and help support that streaming campaign. Once we've done our job, then I can take that information and get playlisting, marketing, activations, excitement from the DSPs, getting people out at shows and really making them feel like they're a part of the whole team, right? Yeah. And then expanding that to what's coming next, the next song, the next EP, the next album. That, there's that always on music industry again. And making sure that these relationships we're building are long term and not just about any given song. We're really trying to prove that the artist is someone who is going to be around and someone we're going to be working with for a long time.
Yeah. Raymond Acosta, who's over at the label with Bad Bunny, mentioned beyond budget, you have to understand the markets, the best time to attack and consumption in different territories. You have to look a step beyond and see if that consumption is coming from a smartphone, a computer, or a tablet. That changes the focus of the campaign and the way we reach the end consumer.
Yeah. Yeah. Take that Brandon Becker one too, because I found that was really interesting, that whole kitchen sink approach.
Yeah, he said it's everything in the kitchen sink. It's really a balance of everything. First and foremost is making sure that it's artist first. When we start a campaign, we love to have a conversation with the artist and their manager and really lay out what is on the table at the moment and then pick and choose our goalposts for the campaign. But we love to see as much engagement with these services because we know that's what gets them ticking. Our pitch is really all-encompassing. It houses everything from our press strategy to our media strategy to our radio strategy, really trying to amplify the hype. And then that's also tied into a marketing campaign, on-the-ground engagement, our physical release strategies. All of it plays hand in hand. And then it's brought to the services on a silver platter. And we look to bolt on the various things depending on which service it is and try to amplify with editorial support, making sure algorithmic curation is optimized based on our release cadence. It's pulling out all the stops is the best way to put it. So we have a couple of interesting phrases there. Algorithmic curation. And of course, we talk about release cadences all the time. And so, that was, we need to come back to that algorithmic curation notion. That's pretty heavy.
Let's just do a couple quick more of these.
Sure.
I know we have to move on to this next piece, but there's so much in this article. Nicole Sabai said, one, start early. And I couldn't agree with that more. I was talking to some friends of mine at Apple Music when we were in Nashville, and one of the gripes was people come to them, on a Monday and say, hey, I'd like these playlists on Friday. And they're like, that is not going to happen. Yeah. You need to get way out in front of this and show them your plan, show them your drivers, and talk about the narrative and why they should care, all of those things that Adam was talking about. So again, Nicole Sabai says, one, start early. Two, have an artist and manager that are very willing to be open-minded on what we can get done. Three, getting that music out to different editorial teams as early as possible, because the longer people can sit with the music and the more we can tell them about it, the better. And I just think that's gold advice.
Absolutely. And I think, to be honest and fair, the music industry has a terrible history with being long term in terms of pacing and and everything. It's an industry where we have historically always kind of had to jam systems because of album is delivered late. There's just so many reasons why it's always happened that way. And this is really forcing us in the industry to be more long-term and to have things set up in a way that you can't force it anymore. You just can't if you want to have success. So
our hats off to Dan Rice.
Yes, Dan.
On this thing. Print this out. It's it's a series of 4. I'm sure there are going to be more. The Changing World of. And this is in Billboard. What a great piece.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. So let's jump over to our last one, Jay, also from Billboard. Spotify lays out roadmap to higher margins. Here's the plan.
Yeah.
Higher margins, Jay. They want to make more money.
Look, They got to make more money, and we've been hearing about this. Glenn Peoples wrote this, and we talk often about how he's on these earnings calls, and he makes sense of these things. And they had this, this presentation is what it was. Spotify CEO Daniel Ek and a parade of top executives had a simple message for investors in a live stream presentation from New York this last Wednesday. Our margins will be better, and you and I are going to dig into how do they get better margins when they're a streaming company? And Daniel Ek said, I'm not sure the journey's very well understood. And frankly, we probably haven't done a very good job of explaining it. Despite posting 24% revenue growth in both 2021 and the first quarter of 2022, the company's share price is down almost 52% in 2022. So they had this presentation, and
which was 4 hours, by the way.
Oh yeah, it's 4
Torturous.
hours. It was called Investor Day, and I read a lot of great pieces. There's a piece in Hypebot that was really great about this. But let's talk a little bit about how are they going to achieve more of this margin.
So they started by saying to achieve this, rather than music, Spotify executives focused on non-music content such as podcasts and audiobooks. To a lesser degree, the company still sees itself primarily as a music service, and music is the cornerstone to its platform. But as it detailed throughout the presentation, by the way, did I mention it was a 4-hour presentation, Jay? The larger opportunity is being an audio company that provides both music and non-music content in a single product.
Right. We talk about podcasts because they can own those or license them. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. Glenn points out that currently podcasts are a financial drain on Spotify. While music has, basically a 28% gross margin, podcast gross margin is minus 57%. Although podcasting grew more than 300% to nearly $200 million in 2021, that came with $103 million negative impact on gross profit. That's from their CFO, Paul Vogel. That's because Spotify must buy and build the tools, products, and exclusive or original content in order to capitalize on this potential. So to date, Spotify has acquired some podcast creators like Gimlet and The Ringer. So those things cost money, and the infrastructure costs money. And yes, will that show profit for them? Yeah, and it'll be better than for music. So that's one area that they talk about is podcasting.
And they do say that they believe it can achieve gross margins of 30 to 35% within 3 to 5 years. And they see a 40 to 50% as attainable further in the future. The trick,
that's a lot.
It's a lot. The trick will be getting the necessary scale. Anchor, which is a platform for do-it-yourself podcast creators, powers more than 75% of Spotify's more than 4 million podcasts, which has grown from fewer than 500,000 since it acquired Anchor in 2019. That is a gigantic number. My God, I was shocked to see that one sort of platform accounts for that high of a percentage of their podcasts.
Yeah.
That's shocking.
And it wasn't that way. Apple owned that territory for the longest time.
Yes, they did.
Glenn points out that it's going to be hard to imagine Spotify getting to its goal of 1 billion users by 2030 just with music alone. So, podcasts, that's one area. They want to own that, just like Amazon owned Audible, kind of owns the audiobook sector. But there's some other areas where they're going to be looking to make some revenue up. And some of those areas, there was an article in Hypebot, and the headline was, to earn $100 billion a year, Spotify shares plans that charge musicians for access. And I want to make sure, we're running out of time here, but I want to make sure we cover these things because it's really crucial how they're looking at potentially bringing in more revenue. The first one, discovery mode. Now, you and I have talked about discovery mode. It's not rolled out to everybody yet, but basically if you sign up for discovery mode, they're going to put your music in front of more people that would probably dig it if they heard it and based on their listening habits. And it's a paid thing, but you don't pay money up front. They just take that out of your royalties that you would make from that. And for a developing artist that doesn't have a big budget, that's a pretty cool thing. So we've been talking about that. Some people are saying, it looks a little close to payola. I don't really like that. But now they're talking about, maybe they're not going to be charging a flat fee. Maybe Spotify takes a commission and, effectively lowering the per stream rate. Spotify argues that Discovery Mode delivers a 40% lift in listeners, half of which say they're new to the artist. So they're hinting that this may not be something that is just taken off of those royalties, that maybe it's paid for, and they want to roll it out to more people. But this is something you and I were just kind of talking about before we hit record, is if everybody using Spotify, and when I say everybody using it, artists that are trying to promote their music, if they all do Discovery Mode, doesn't that dilute
just negate,
the pool?
Yeah, just dilute and completely dilute the platform. Absolutely. They're also talking about visual native ads. They're the free, of course, as you know, the free streaming service is supported by advertising. They're planning to sell more, and they have a new ad product called Marquee, which it went self-service in the U.S. last year, which doubled the number of new customers, leading to a Q1 revenue increase of 224% compared to the previous year. So,
we use Marquee, and those ads are more effective with some artists than others, but it's a pretty cool, banner that you can use with Spotify, and getting it in front of those folks that are on the ad-supported version of Spotify. And so I can see them, look, Discovery Mode, maybe they make more money. Podcasts, maybe they make more money. Now you're talking about these native, meaning, on the platform ads. And then another one that they talk about is ticketing.
Yeah.
Spotify said that they've helped to sell more than $300 million in ticket sales through its partnerships with ticketing companies. Unsaid was that Spotify receives a commission from most of these sales. So that's another way that I hadn't thought about where they can drive revenue. And the last one, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, but really quickly, as we mentioned, Fans First. Fans First is this cool thing in Spotify where Spotify will determine a certain number of fans for an artist, maybe in a certain region, and they'll, originally there would be events, like maybe you'd go bowling with Taylor Swift or something like that. Now it's really broken into a couple of different areas, at least as far as I can tell. One is tickets and the other is merch. So if you do land a Fans First campaign for one of your artists, it's usually an exclusive piece of merch. Maybe it's a vinyl thing, maybe it's a t-shirt, whatever, in a limited run for those super fans of that artist, right? And the other one is maybe either early or exclusive access to tickets. So before you jumped into that, I wanted to kind of explain what Fans First was.
Right. And it says Spotify does not currently take a cut of sales or its tipping feature, but that could change. So, listen.
You just mentioned tipping feature.
Yeah.
I'd even forgotten about that. That's like the artist pick on Spotify. You can do crowdfunding, or you can have money that's for charity, whatever you want to do. But again, that's one of those areas when I was thinking about how can they monetize, or how can they get more margin? Yeah, they could take a bigger chunk of that. Or it sounds like they're not taking a chunk right now of that. And then, of course, that Shopify integration.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are a lot of different ways I hadn't really thought of where they could generate more margin. But as you pointed out last week, this is their only gig. They don't have hardware. Yes, they do have that car thing, but in general, they don't have the things that like Google has or Apple has or Amazon has. Those other companies aren't reliant just on music. In fact, I would argue that if music was taken away tomorrow, they would still be fine. Whereas Spotify, it would be a challenge to just have a platform that was podcasts, and audiobooks. That music is so important to their business, but it sounds like they're branching out into other areas to monetize.
Money is the new gatekeeper. It says Spotify once promised to eliminate the gatekeepers, deliver a global audience, and help more musicians earn a living. But that promise has shifted, Jay. Now Spotify will help an artist build an audience if they are able to pay for it.
There it is.
It is what it
There
is.
it is.
It is what it is. And on that note, Jay, what it is we need to wrap up episode number 96 of the podcast. Jay and I want to thank everybody for listening. And of course, we want to thank the groovy folks over at Hypebot and Bands in Town for helping us put the show on every week. We could not do it without them. Big thanks to them. And Jay, let's wrap it up. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back next week on the Your Morning Coffee podcast.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.